Before we start,
Yeah.
if I may, I have to tell you that I'm on stage with one of my heroes. And yes.
The man who's doing the signing.
Yes, also for sure. For many, many years, when I was working, making commentaries at the local NPR station in Chicago, WBEZ, dreaming of being on All Things Considered, dreaming of being on the weekend All Things Considered, the shows that you host.
You don't have to dream.
I know.
You're there.
I know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I dreamt that you would say my name. Like, you know how like at the end you say like, that was John Green, an author from Chicago or whatever. I would dream that you would say that in your voice. And it happened. And then in 2012, and I promise I will stop flattering you after this.
No way. I think we can take a little time.
Okay,
I mean,
we'll take our time
As long as we're done by 6:15, I think we're all right.
In 2012, you interviewed me about The Fault in Our Stars. It was one of the first interviews I did about The Fault in Our Stars.
And an absolute, you probably all know it, but an absolutely astonishing book.
Thank you.
It's just wonderful.
And you know how often you do that stuff, and how often, I mean, you do it every weekend, but like for me, you know, eventually I would do thousands of interviews about The Fault in Our Stars, and none stuck with me like that one. And so I just wanted to say thank you for welcoming that book into the world and like increasing its breadth and allowing that book to become what it did. It really means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think you hardly needed our interview to make that book a success, but it's nice to hear anyway. I think you've written an extraordinary book here. Everything is Tuberculosis.
Thanks.
And I'm so glad that you brought this to our attention. And I want to begin by asking you about a young man named Henry, who sort of brought it to your attention.
Yeah, I never would have known about tuberculosis. I never would have gotten obsessed with it if it weren't for Henry, and Henry is really the backbone of the book. So in 2019, I was in Sierra Leone to learn about the maternal health care system there. Many people in this room probably are part of our long-term community project to work with the Sierra Leonean government to improve the quality of maternal and infant health in Sierra Leone. You can say woo if you are. Thank you. And so my wife and I were visiting Sierra Leone for that reason, but then on the last day of our trip, one of the doctors we were traveling with was like, hey, on the way to the airport, we need to go to this tuberculosis hospital because there's some cases I have to consult on. And I was like, two things. First off, like, I did not know that there were tuberculosis hospitals, I'm embarrassed to say. And secondly, that is inconvenient to me. I would like to go to the airport, was my other thought, if I'm being honest. And thank God we went to this hospital because it changed my life dramatically. When we got there, this little kid, whose name was Henry, which is the name of my son, grabbed me by the shirt and physically took me all around the hospital. He took me to the kitchen where people were making food. He took me to the lab where people were typing tuberculosis in microscopes, looking for TB in microscopes and sputum samples. He took me to the wards where people were very, very sick. I mean, I've you know, worked as a chaplain in a children's hospital. I've been around sick people a lot in my life, and I very rarely have been with people who were that sick, that close to death in many cases. And then eventually he took me back to the doctors, and they kind of shooed him away. And I was like, whose kid is that? Is that one of your kids? And they were like, no, he's a patient. In fact, he's one of the patients that we're really worried about, that we came here to talk about. And I was like, but he seems fine. And they were like, well, I mean, yeah, he seems okay now because he's responding to antibiotics, but we can tell from his sputum samples that he's not responding well enough to them. And when they fail, that's the last line of antibiotics available to us. Now, it wasn't the last line of antibiotics available to me, but it was the last line of antibiotics available to people in Sierra Leone, and at the time. And I was just shocked by this. I was shocked by how sick people were. I was shocked by Henry's story. And so I was shocked by the fact that I didn't know that TB is the world's deadliest infectious disease. I would have bet everything I have that it was malaria or HIV or typhoid or something else. I mean, TB seems like a problem of the past, because it should be a problem of the past, because we've known how to cure it since the 1950s. And so, you know, our era. And so meeting Henry caused me to go home and just get absolutely obsessed with tuberculosis. I wanted to understand what was wrong with my information feed, that I didn't know how bad this disease was, but I also wanted to understand like what was wrong with my social order, that we were allowing this to continue to happen, that we were allowing over 1 million people to die year after year after year of this disease that we know how to treat and cure and prevent. And I wanted to follow what was going to happen to Henry, because even though, like I said, there were no lines of antibiotics still available for Henry, there were antibiotics that Henry could take. It wasn't going to be easy. You know, curing TB is not like curing a sinus infection. I keep saying antibiotics, and most of us associate antibiotic regimens with like 10 days or something, you know?
Yeah.
And then you don't take the last 3 days.
That's not a good idea.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott. If you come
yeah.
away from this with one thing, take all your antibiotics.
Yeah.
You've been lectured.
I notice you shaking your head, man.
So TB is not easy to cure. It takes months of antibiotics taken every day, often in combinations. The side effects are serious. It's a very difficult disease to treat. But you know, my brother had cancer a couple years ago, and at no point in my brother's cancer treatment did anyone say, well, unfortunately, it's just more cost-effective to prevent your cancer than it is to cure it. Now, it is more cost-effective to prevent cancer than it is to cure it, but we still cure cancer because, of course, we do. Of course, that's our obligation to ourselves and one another.
This is going to sound incredibly naive.
Yeah.
Why so little tuberculosis in the United States and so much in Sierra Leone?
That's a great question. I mean, 100 years ago, tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in the US. Like, at the height of the TB crisis, when my great-uncle Stokes Goodrich died of tuberculosis in a sanatorium in Asheville, North Carolina, there were almost as many hospital beds just for TB patients in the United States as there were hospital beds for all other healthcare conditions combined. That's how big of a problem tuberculosis was in the United States. And now it's really not. You're right. It's not as big of a problem. Now, we still have about 10,000 cases of active tuberculosis in the US every year, which is a lot. It's a tiny fraction of the overall burden of tuberculosis, but you see it in the same communities that you see it in Sierra Leone or in Indonesia or in India or anywhere else. You see it among people who are marginalized. You see it among people who are impoverished. You see it among people who are unhoused. You see it especially among people who live in crowded or work in crowded conditions, because that's where the disease most spreads. You see it people who spend a lot of time on public transport, especially really crowded public transport. So in a country like Sierra Leone, where most transport is incredibly crowded, where most housing has poor ventilation, where people live in crowded conditions, often, not always, but often, where they work in crowded conditions, it's just much easier for TB to spread. And the other thing is that we do a pretty good job, actually, like, I realize, and I will say this sort of generally, that public health is under threat around the world right now, but we do a pretty good job of preventing TB infections. So I was just speaking earlier today in the green room, actually, with a young woman who survived tuberculosis when she was 18, but she never actually developed what we call active disease because she was screened for TB, like everyone should be. They identified that she had the bug inside of her body, and then they gave her preventative medicine to cure it so that she never has to worry about developing active disease. And that should have been the story for Henry. That should be the story for every person who's exposed to TB. It's not that hard. It's just expensive. And I'm sure we'll get into why it's expensive and whether it needs to be expensive. But yeah, I think ultimately we still have TB in the United States. It's still a threat. We still need to devote resources to it. But because we have a lower rate of absolute poverty, because we have a lower rate of people living in crowded living conditions, we also have a lower rate of TB.
One of the arguments you pursue in the book, and I must say totally convinced me, is that you say our histories do not pay enough attention to disease.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. It's wild. I mean, you go to college and you learn about trade routes and wars and kings and kings and kings and kings and king after emperor after king. And never do you learn about what actually kills almost everyone. Which is not war, fortunately, which is not murder, fortunately. It's disease. Disease kills 93% of us. Like 93% of us will die of what we call natural causes. But in many cases, those causes are not natural. They're caused by failures of our social order to acknowledge and accept that all human beings are equally valuable. They're caused by resource distribution, failures of resource distribution. And so I do think that we should study disease more as a historical force. And I think the reason we don't, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the reason we don't is that we like stories of human agency. Like, I like the idea that humans are shaping the human story, that like we are mostly the ones doing the work and not bacteria, right? Like, that's a little alarming. If bacteria...
A little demeaning. I mean,
Yeah, because
I say that with respect to bacteria.
You better respect them.
Knowing the influence they can have.
Yeah, you better respect them. They're out for you. Spend a lot of time thinking about that, sir.
Wow.
And I think we like stories of humans doing human things that impact other humans, and we don't like stories of bacteria doing things that impact humans. But that said, the story of bacteria is the story of humans because we build the systems and structures through which the bacteria flow. Like, we are the ones who blaze the trail of injustice that allows someone like Henry to get tuberculosis in the first place.
You write at one point, we know how to live in a world without TB, but we choose not to live in that world.
I think we do. I think we do. Now, it would not be easy. And like, one of the things that drives me a little nuts is when someone like me comes up on stage and says, like, tuberculosis is curable and preventable and we should live in a world without it. We should. That's all true. But like, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that malaria is also a huge driver of tremendous suffering, especially among children, or that HIV/AIDS is a driver of suffering, or that heart disease and cancer are drivers of suffering. And so, like, at some point, you know, what I don't want is for me to be out here saying, like, we got to cure tuberculosis at the expense of addressing the cancer crisis, or we got to cure tuberculosis at the expense of addressing the malaria crisis, because I just don't think that's true. I do think that TB is the world's best current barometer for the absolute injustice of poverty. I do think that, like, TB is, maybe cholera as well, as another disease that just is caused by poverty, not caused by the bacteria. Or in cholera's case, the virus, he said without a lot of confidence. No, it isn't bacteria, right? Whatever.
We're moving
on. We're moving on. We're in a generous audience.
Someone
that
here will
loves
know
me.
the answer.
Okay, y'all know. That was a quiz. And so I do think we can live in a world without TB, but it would require sacrifice. It would require us to make big investments. I mean, think about the big investment the United States made with PEPFAR, this project to address HIV/AIDS in impoverished communities. Now, this was in the George W. Bush administration. A lot of people came together and decided the United States is going to work to lower the prices of drugs so that they're more accessible in impoverished communities, and the United States is going to create systems, is going to work with partners around the world to create systems so that those HIV drugs can actually get to the people who need them. And as a result, we've seen HIV death go down really, really dramatically in the last 20 years. Now, it was too late. It's still not sufficient. There are still too many people being born with HIV. And frankly, now, as a result of decisions being made around the world, there will be more kids needlessly born with HIV. And that is very, very frustrating. And I don't want to take away anything from the reality of that ongoing injustice and suffering. But the progress is also real, right? Like, one of the hardest things for me is how do you hold the tension between the progress is real and the progress is insufficient? I don't know how to do that well, but that is something I think about a lot with TB, because while it is true that every person who dies of TB dies needlessly, it is also true that half as many people die of TB as died the year I graduated from college. That progress is real, that progress is insufficient. I don't know how to reconcile that. I do know that if we made the sacrifices that I think we should be making in order to ensure that all people have access to healthcare in the United States and globally, if we made the sacrifices that I think we should be making in order to ensure that someone like Henry can have access to basic care, then I think we would live in a better world.
Yeah. Tell us about Shreya Tripathi, a young woman from India who Well, I'll let you tell the story, but she was trying to survive but had to battle through the courts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. She had to battle, bureaucracy as well as tuberculosis, which is often the case with young people, especially living with TB, because they don't get the newest, best treatments. So Shreya Tripathi was a young woman who got tuberculosis. One of the reasons I know about her, actually, to bring it back to The Fault in Our Stars, is that she was a big fan of The Fault in Our Stars. I found this out many years later when one of her doctors reached out to me and told me this and put it in her put it in writing about her. Anyway, Shreya was living with tuberculosis. Like Henry, she failed the second-line drugs, and like Henry, when she failed the second-line drugs, she was told, there are no options available for you. And Shreya said, well, what about this drug bedaquiline that is designed exactly for people who are in situations like mine? And the Indian healthcare system at the time said, no, we can't afford that. And so Shreya sued the government and won the case. She eventually won the case, arguing that bedaquiline should be available to her and people like her. But by the time she won the case, unfortunately, her lungs had been so damaged by tuberculosis that even though the drug did successfully kill all of the TB, she still died, because she essentially died the way that many TB patients do, just due to lack of oxygen and inability for her lungs to get enough oxygen in them to feed her body. And because of her heroism, because of what she did, because she stood up for her rights, many people today in India are successfully being treated with bedaquiline. And not only that, because of other activists and advocates, the price of bedaquiline, it was just announced a couple days ago actually, has gone down by about 80% from what it cost just 5 or 6 years ago. And that's not because it's made of platinum and we figured out how to mine platinum less expensively, right? We all know why it used to cost vastly more than it does now, which is that it used to be under patent, and then activists and advocates around the world basically pressured this company, Johnson & Johnson, that owned the patent and was trying to evergreen that patent to ensure that they could enjoy the patent for another 10 or 20 or 30 years. Activists and courts pressured Johnson & Johnson, and eventually J&J abandoned those efforts, and now there's generic competition, and as a result, bedaquiline is vastly less expensive. And I understand like the role that patents and intellectual property and stuff plays in our economy. Like, I am an author. Like, I understand the idea of, the value of intellectual property. But I also think that has to be balanced against the reality that many people are being denied access to life-saving care because of cost, especially in impoverished communities. It was just unthinkable. When curing multi-drug resistant tuberculosis costs $3,000 per person, it was really, really difficult for a country like Sierra Leone that has about $48 per person per year to spend on healthcare to justify that cost. That's not Sierra Leone's fault. That's the fault of the fact that it costs $3,000. Well, now it costs $280. And as a result, many more people in Sierra Leone and other impoverished countries are much more likely to be able to be effectively treated with tuberculosis medications, which means that every time we stop one of those chains of transmission, right? It's not like heart disease, it's not like cancer. Every time we stop one of those chains of transmission, that's all kinds of other people who don't get sick. And so every time we can kind of narrow the funnel, that's how we get to a place where we only have 10,000 cases of active TB in a country, is by ending those chains of transmission one at a time. And making the cure vastly less expensive takes us a long way down that road. And that is good news for impoverished healthcare systems. It's good news for people living with TB. Ultimately, it's good news for society. And yet, it isn't happening where it needs to be happening because of the patent protections on these life-saving drugs being applied in the poorest possible communities.
Let me ask you about another scintilla of the argument that some people in pharmaceuticals have given me over the years.
Yeah.
Which they have said, look, we need to make profits because we need to keep developing new treatments. And if you want to keep the level of treatment fine for the rest of our existence, we can do it very cheaply.
Right.
But we have to be ready in case something like COVID comes along, and we have to leap into action.
I think this is a good argument, and I think that's why pharmaceutical companies make plenty of money. They don't just pour money into research, though. If they did, I would find that argument incredibly compelling. But the truth is they pour a very small percentage of profit into research and pour a lot of profit into marketing and especially into shareholder returns. And I understand like that is the fiscal environment in which we work. That is the world in which we live, but I truly believe it's not the world in which we will always live. Like Ursula K. Le Guin observed once, I think this is just brilliant. She observed once that we live in a world of, people in the 17th century in Europe lived in a world of absolute monarchy. They could not and did not understand that there was a world without absolute monarchy, and yet there was. And like, that will be the story for us as well.
How emotionally wrenching was it for you to write this story?
It was hard. I mean, all of my stories are hard. I mean, not that hard, not compared to like real work. It's make-believe. I guess this isn't make-believe. This is make-true. But like, the part that was hard was talking to Henry and Aissatou and other people living with tuberculosis and talking to families of people who died. It was emotionally difficult just because I am complicit in a lot of that. I'm not separate from the world. I'm not an observer of the world. I'm a participant in it, and I'm an extraordinarily privileged participant in it. And like, what does it say about me and my information feed and my resource distribution that I'm participating in this world in the way that I am? That was difficult for me. And then there's just the hard, I mean, honestly, it's hard to deeply love someone who lives far away. It's hard to deeply love someone who lives in really difficult circumstances. Like Henry is extraordinarily well supported today, but I know that lots of people in Sierra Leone aren't. I know that lots of people I know aren't, and that's difficult in a way. The hardest thing about writing the book, honestly, was like just being stuck with the facts. Facts are frustrating and stubborn and underrated at the moment, I should say.
Facts and alternative facts.
Yeah. Everybody's got their set of facts, I guess. But that's also what I love about writing nonfiction, is that I got to have so many wonderful conversations with Henry and with his mother and with his family. And I found, like, sometimes it's frustrating because you want someone to say something in a certain way so that you can put it in the book, right? Like, that's always on your mind. Like, it's frustrating that you're limited by the truth. As a novel writer, I get frustrated by being limited by the facts. But at the same time, I found that if I just listened to Henry longer and better, it was always there. There was always something richer than I could have imagined or more interesting than I could have imagined. If I listened to Aissatou longer and more, there was always something better. And then the other thing that I did, I'm not a journalist. I don't know, your job seems very hard, but
No, Jesus, no.
the other thing I did...
I wouldn't be doing it if it was that hard. I wouldn't be able to do it if it was that hard.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
My wife is in the audience laughing harder than anyone else at that one. Yeah.
When I used to complain to my dad about writing, he would be like, what kind of jobs does it beat? And I'd be like, most. Anyway, I found that the other thing I tried to do was, because there's a cultural divide and a language divide and a physical divide, all kinds of divides between Henry and me, I would always try to repeat back what I heard from him to make sure that I got it, and I would often find that I didn't have it. I would also often repeat it back to him, and he'd be like, no, Dad, like, no, you don't, there's something important here you're not getting. And that was very helpful for me. So yeah, I recommend that to anybody who likes to ask people questions. Make sure you've actually got it.
You've mentioned Aissatou a couple of times. Let me
Yeah.
get you to talk about her.
Yeah, so Henry's mom is a woman named Aissatou who grew up really you know, to hear her talk about her childhood is really one of those lovely things. She talks about being woven with her friends and with her family, and in this really tight-knit community that was very supportive of her. But then her lives and so many more were torn asunder by the Sierra Leonean Civil War, which lasted for 15 years and was just unbelievably terrible, like all war tends to be. And she had to move to Freetown. She eventually got married and had 2 children, Henry and Favor. And Favor was a young girl who was Henry's little sister. And they were very, very close. He would take her to kindergarten every morning when he was in 2nd or 3rd grade and pick her up at the end of every day. And then eventually Favor developed what was almost certainly a benign tumor in her throat. But even though it wasn't a cancer, it eventually closed off her windpipe and she died. And that's another example of, and she died when she was 7, and that's another example of someone whose life would have been saved by even fairly straightforward access to medical care, the kind of medical care that all of us expect and all of us deserve. And that was devastating for Aissatou, devastating for Henry, and then Henry got sick for the first time before that, and then he got sick again with tuberculosis when he was about 12, so just a few years after Favor's death. So, Aissatou has had an incredibly challenging life. She started out selling perfumes and oils, like essential oils, in a marketplace. That was sort of how she scraped together a living, but it was very challenging. And as Henry got sick, it became almost impossible for her to make a living. Most people who have TB, I mean, part of the tragedy of TB is that it's a highly stigmatized disease. And so people living with tuberculosis are often abandoned by their families. I mean, I've had many nurses tell me that the hardest part of their job is not treating tuberculosis or seeing patients die. The hardest part of their job is burying patients alone with no one else to mourn them because they've been abandoned by their families. And Henry was incredibly fortunate that Aissatou never abandoned her. And he credits his survival as much to Aissatou as he does to the drugs that he was eventually able to receive. She would bring him extra food, which kept him well fed. I mean, they try to serve 3 meals a day at Lacas Hospital, but it's really difficult. The constraints there, as Henry likes to say, are really extreme. And so there's a lot of people who can't get access to even the basics, even adequate nutrition. And when you're recovering from tuberculosis, you get so hungry because it's a wasting disease. And so as your body starts to feel better, you have this huge caloric deficit that's been building up, and you're so hungry and you simply can't get enough food. And so bringing him extra food, he thinks, was a big part of why he survived.
6 to 9 pills a day, right?
6 to 9 pills a day if you're lucky. More than that. I mean, Henry took 20,000 pills over the course of his 3 years being treated for tuberculosis. And toxic pills. I mean, he lost hearing in one ear.
Yeah.
He has all kinds of ongoing issues, and that's common. I mean, these pills, because it's not a huge market, because pharmaceutical companies aren't particularly incentivized to develop new antibiotics for tuberculosis, we have a lot of the same drugs we had in the 50s and 60s. And so these are not, we've made a lot of progress with, for instance, chemotherapy drugs. We've not made a lot of progress with the drugs that treat TB.
And let me ask you about that incentivized aspect, because I know one of the things I've noticed, I'm afraid, covering disease and areas of conflict over the years, there is a real competition for public attention between famine, tuberculosis,
Yeah,
HIV.
oh my God, it's endless, right? I mean, the horrors abound in every direction.
And I'm afraid at some level it is a battle for attention. It's public relations, it's a struggle to get attention from...
It's a battle for attention, but isn't a lot of our attention going to like horse hoof cleaning videos?
I've got to catch up with those myself, but yes,
or other, I mean, like that genre. Those are great, by the way.
I am a sucker for cute pet videos.
Well,
cute animal
yeah, I
videos,
mean, these
I
are
must
not
say.
cute.
Yeah. Horse cleaning videos?
Yeah, they clean out the hooves and then they put a new shoe on. Oh, you know, I heard a woo. Somebody else has my TikTok algorithm.
I didn't know what I was missing, but
Yes,
all right. Yeah.
I think a lot of what we, my friend Amy Krauss Rosenthal, who died a few years ago, who was one of my mentors and one of my best friends, used to say, I don't mean closest friends, I mean like best friends, like awesomest friends. She used to say, pay attention to what you pay attention to. And you're right. We can't pay attention all the time to the horrors that are coming from every direction, because they really are coming from every direction. And they're all real, right? Like, that's something I think is important to acknowledge and honor. Like, they're real. It's not that people are overreacting. It's not like, this is a very difficult moment in many, many ways. And tuberculosis is just one tiny part of that big pie. But it's the part I've chosen. And I have to trust other people to choose the rest of the pie, because they have to kind of trust me a little bit. But I think we are in a competition for attention as much as we're in a competition for resources, because we tend to solve the problems we pay attention to. We tend to solve the problems we know about, and we tend not to solve the problems we don't know about. And ultimately, that's why I wrote this book, is because I want TB to be on more people's radar. But I do worry sometimes. That's why I mentioned earlier, like, not at the expense of malaria, not at the expense of other diseases, because there are multiple crises. We just have to somehow expand the size of the pie to address them.
How do you decide what to write about? How do you decide now's time for a novel, now's the time for nonfiction?
Well, I mean, that would be great if I had a strategy. I mean, you can imagine the delight at my publishing house when I told them.
Oh, I want to do a book about tuberculosis.
Yeah. The next one's
Love it,
about
John.
tuberculosis.
Love it. Yeah.
They were like, "What do you know about tuberculosis?" And I was like, "As it happens, a lot." But no, they were actually very supportive, I should say, and I'm very grateful for that. But I know why I stopped writing fiction, I think, which is that, like, I wrote this novel about a kid with OCD, and I have OCD, and people couldn't help but read me into the novel, right? Like, people couldn't help but see the ways that my own life, which I have made extraordinarily public through my own choice, has it affected and shaped that book, right? And what was so difficult about that for me was that I felt like I wasn't writing fiction. I was writing some kind of like nonfiction that people, or fiction that people were trying to turn into nonfiction. It was just very difficult for me to figure out how to manage that.
They weren't reading it as a novel?
It felt like they couldn't read it as a novel, right? Like, you can't say like, hey, the author is dead. Do not pay attention to the author, but do follow me on Blue Sky, right? Like, you can't say that. It's not fair. And so I felt a little defensive. I felt like that. I felt like, why can't you just read this as a novel? Well, how could they? I'm on their Instagram feed nonstop. I'm trying to get their attention in all kinds of different ways. I'm trying to sell them coffee, and here at the same time, I'm also saying, like, but don't read me into the novel. Read this as a work of fiction. But they can hear my voice sometimes when they read it, because, they've paid attention to that. And that's something that I'm grateful for. And so it was a hard thing to figure out my way through. And then eventually I decided, well, I'll just write as myself. That solves the problem. What if I wrote about myself as myself? And so that's what I've tried to do since. And even in Everything is Tuberculosis, while it's obviously not about me, hopefully, if I did my job, hopefully it's about tuberculosis mostly. Even in that, though, I knew that I had to be there. Like, I had to acknowledge my place in the story.
They're characters. I mean, you bring characters to life.
Yeah, and I have to be one of those characters. Like, so that said, I miss writing fiction. I would like to write fiction again. I hope I will.
I like your fiction.
Thanks, man. That means a lot.
I hope you return to it, and I think I can. I mean, I can't speak for the entire editorial process, but I think if you were to write another novel, there's a possibility that you could get a very high-profile interview.
That would be pretty special.
Yeah.
That would be pretty special.
To add to the widespread public optimism nowadays,
Yes.
TB is actually rising in the United States, isn't it?
It is. TB is getting worse in the United States. And unfortunately, I mean, it had been getting, so we've been seeing, I'll talk about the US and the world. In the US, it's definitely getting worse. We're going to cross 10,000 cases a year for the first time in like 15 years. It's not a good situation, and that's partly because of the hollowing out of our public health systems and our inability to identify TB earlier and stop chains of transmission. So we've seen a significant outbreak in Kansas over the last few years. I talked with a TB doctor a few weeks ago who just lost someone, had someone die of TB in Indianapolis, where I live. And so usually TB isn't fatal in the United States, but occasionally it still can be, especially if it's diagnosed very late. And so that's getting worse. And then globally, we were starting to see things get better. They got much worse during COVID because so much of the global health resources had to go to addressing COVID, which is totally appropriate, I guess. But then it was getting better, and so this year was the lowest rate of TB I think we've ever seen, but it's going to get worse. There's no two ways about it. I mean, if you think of the history of tuberculosis as a long staircase, and we start out on the bottom stair with like Hippocrates telling his students, don't even try to treat this disease, it'll make you look like a bad doctor. And we slowly work our way up the staircase. Eventually we develop a vaccine. It's not very good, but it's a vaccine. 100 years ago, we developed some drugs to treat TB. They're not very good at first, but they get a little bit better in the 1950s and 60s. And then we develop preventative therapy, and we slowly walk up this staircase. We get better diagnostic tools. Well, we fell down the staircase in the last several months, and that's centered here, but this is not the only place where it's an issue. It's also an issue in Europe, where people are pulling back from global health funding, and so that will have a direct result of more people getting tuberculosis, unfortunately, and ultimately more people dying.
What can a book do that Instagram can't?
Oh, that's a great question, Scott. Whew, a lot.
I mean, you could have just...
I mean, it's a great question, and I think the answer is something. I heard...
That's really...
And scene.
Could we pause? I think everybody here wants to write that down. The answer is something.
Yeah. It reminds me of this mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, who ran for re-election on the campaign slogan, "Let's do something." Not something good necessarily, but something.
Yeah.
For the love of God, no more inaction. He's in prison now.
And he's not an Illinois politician.
No. Yeah,
I'm kind of proud of that.
All over.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So anyway, I think the answer is something. Last night, I got to hear Chimamanda Adichie speak, and I know. It was incredible. I recommend going on C-SPAN's archives and listening to what she had to say. It was really, really beautiful. And one of the things that she said is that literature is intimate. There is a closeness when you're reading that there isn't when you're watching Instagram, because you're the co-creator of that story. Like, the way you read the book or listen to the book or engage with the book is fundamentally different from how anyone else will, just because that's the reality. Like, you are making the story as much as I am making the story. You're choosing when to skip paragraphs because they're boring. You're choosing when to settle your eyes on a certain sentence or write it down or underline it or dog-ear the page or whatever. And there's a closeness in reading that I think if you do a good job, you make those characters so real for the reader that they care about them in a way that you don't care about even someone close to you. Like, if you think about the way that we talk about even the people who are close to us, you said my spouse, my best friend, my sibling. It's always in the context of myself. But when I'm, hopefully when you're reading this book, Henry isn't anything to you. It's that you're as close to being Henry as we can get in this world. Like, it's as close as you can get outside of yourself to being someone else.
And tell us about Henry. It's one of the great pleasures of the book is getting getting to know him, getting instilled a little bit by his extraordinary spirit and his smile.
He does have an extraordinary spirit, and Henry was eventually able to access the drugs that he needed to survive TB. He was cured of the disease. Now, he lost most of what would have been his high school years to being in this hospital. But he was able to kind of take a crash course in, not literally, in high school, get through high school really quickly because he's, not only is he bright, he's incredibly hardworking. Like Henry and I talk almost every day, and like every day he's studying. He studies nonstop. And today he is a senior at the University of Sierra Leone. He's studying human resources, which I know is a disappointment. I'm just kidding. That's my favorite joke.
It's a good one, yeah.
Yeah, he's doing great. He's just an incredible, and his mother is doing really well. And you know, they are, like I said earlier, you know, now in a situation where they're well supported and have you know, the life that that wasn't available to them for so long, and that they have always deserved. And so, you know, they just got solar power in their house, so now Henry can read at night, which he's very excited about because his big complaint was that he could only study during the daytime hours. And now he's studying at night as well, and he's just doing great. He's a really good student, and I know he has a really bright future.
Yeah. And speaking of the future, do you know what's next for you?
Well, I kind of do, actually, but I'm not supposed to talk about it, but I will since you asked. I'm a people pleaser. Yeah. I'm writing a novel. I'm writing a novel about...
Oh, good.
Yeah. It's a Hollywood novel, so it's about two kids in a movie and the industry and fame and all that jazz.
And you've learned.
I've had a little bit of exposure to it, yeah. So I get to write about, again, read it as a novel. The author is dead. Do not pay attention to the author, says the author loudly. But yeah, I do have some personal experience on that one.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to that. Well, I think we'll all look forward to that. Everything is Tuberculosis, the history and persistence of our deadliest infection. This is an important book. I dare say, boy, I don't want to say you'll learn a lot from it because it sounds like I'm being, you will enjoy it. It will lift your heart. It's a tough story in many ways, but it will lift your heart to know that there are so many good people who are doing something and figuring out ways to live and trying to make our world better. So I'm so glad you did this book. John Green, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.